texture that's nice and fluffy. Hi, I'm Emily, and today we're going to talk about music. I've always had fond memories associated with classic rock. Ever since I can remember, I've been singing Simon and Garfunkel and James Taylor and the Animals in the car with my sister. When I finally got a Spotify account, it didn't take long for me to discover a whole new world of rock, and that began with the origins of punk rock. My top artists became Patti Smith, I listened to Horses on repeat and bought the vinyl, and of course the Velvet Underground. And I have to admit, for a really long time, my favorite album by them was Loaded, but that opinion completely changed after I watched the Velvet Underground documentary. I think when you have a deeper understanding for how and why certain pieces of art were made, it makes you appreciate that art even more. And that was certainly true when I finished watching the documentary, especially when it came to unpacking the story behind the creation of the Banana album, or the Velvet Underground and Nico. So the movie opens with a Warhol-esque split screen shot of a close-up of Lou Reed's face on one side of the screen, and then pictures from Lou's childhood on the other side of the screen. We get some voiceover from Lou where he reflects on moving from Brooklyn to the Long Island suburbs at age 4, and we get a closer look into what his family life was like. His dad was an accountant who probably gave up on bigger dreams. So it was basically the definition of average Americana suburban life, but from a really young age, Lou knew that he wanted to be a rock star. And he only ever had one in-person guitar lesson, which is pretty cool. He said that he just learned how to play guitar from listening to records over and over again. I think Lou always had this really hardcore, like punk rock, do-it-yourself kind of attitude. I mean, he started booking shows when he was still in high school. Alright, so the next kind of main character is John Cale, and I'll admit, going into the movie, I didn't know who he was, and that's mostly because I've only ever listened to Loaded, and he's not on Loaded. I'd really only known of Lou, but after watching the documentary, it's so clear that John was incredibly instrumental to the creation of the original band. So John described his early life as being pretty grim, growing up on the Welsh countryside. He learned how to speak English at 7, so he couldn't really communicate with his father until then. And he imagined what his life could be like or become by listening to foreign radio broadcasts. He learned how to play the viola, and he said that he wanted to be a conductor, but he knew that first he had to get out of the isolated Welsh countryside. So it was pretty clear that both Lou and John felt pretty limited by their environment, but that would all change with the clash of culture and art that was 1960s New York City. Artists like Andy Warhol were experimenting with the mediums of film and sound, and Lamont Young tested the possibilities of long-sustained drones in songs. Young would take John under his wing and explore tone and the natural harmonics in music. He'd even tune his music to refrigerator hums. What I appreciate is that the film doesn't romanticize New York City. 1960s New York was crowded and dirty and had pretty dismal mental health resources. And while it's true that Lou did use his experiences seeking out heroin in Harlem as writing material, it's not necessarily painted in a positive light. Lou's writing also revealed a deeper urge to explore his authentic sexuality, but even in New York at the time, deviating from the established heterosexual norms was labeled a crime against nature by political leaders. What I really appreciate about Lou's lyrics is that they're brazenly authentic. He writes about the pain and the hurt that mirrors his own reality. According to Lou, his songs are about guys who are sick and dissatisfied with life, where music must back up the lyrics. The two other members of the original Velvet Underground band, Sterling and Mo Morrison, join Lou and John after attending Syracuse University, and with the help of Barbara Rubin, they start recording music at the factory. And they experiment a lot with improv, which is kind of reminiscent of Bob Dylan's recording tactics, and they also repeat riffs with drone. At this point, the band starts collaborating a lot more with Andy Warhol, and Warhol suggests that the band needs some sort of feminine beauty, and that's when the film introduces us to Nico. Nico's described as hauntingly beautiful and uncanny. She has a very unique and identifiable singing style. What I think is really interesting is that the Velvet Underground has two female band members, Nico and Mo, and they both bring something unique and really special to the band. So while Mo dresses a little bit more tomboyish and androgynously, she still has a really sweet and bright presence about her. And Nico, on the other hand, is kind of dark and mysterious and has this very deep, droning voice. And I think this is really important because the working environment in the factory was described as being very unkind to women, where women were only really valued for their body or their looks, but Mo and Nico are both very serious and talented musicians, so we see how they kind of defy those standards. So at this point, Andy Warhol is sponsoring the Velvet Underground, and Tom Wilson, who also produced Bob Dylan and Simon and Garfunkel, is producing the Banana Album, or the Velvet Underground and Nico. So the Velvet Underground was kind of seen as a group of 60s hipsters who didn't really produce music that was accepted by the mainstream. In their lyrics, they discuss sex work, drugs, unconventional sexual exploration, and their music isn't broadcasted a lot on wider national radio stations. So when they finally get to traveling to LA, their all-black clothing and kind of ominous demeanor is pretty sharply contrasted by the free-loving hippie movement in California. So they didn't necessarily mesh very well with 1960s pop culture, but they did gain a cult following in the New York City music scene. I actually wrote this quote down because I thought it was really meaningful, so I just had to write it down during the movie. The artist is not with society, they're different. They're anti-hippie. The Velvet Underground was new and radically different. They used these hypnotic melodies that really weren't tied to conventions, which I think were especially clear on tracks like Venus and Furs. We also get this side character, Jonathan Richman, who's kind of like an audience stand-in. He says, "These people would understand me," and that really resonated with me because I feel like the Velvet Underground's lyrics discuss the darker themes of life that often go unexplored. Lou Reed's lyrics are incredibly honest, and when I listen to the Velvet Underground's music, it feels like reality is being seen and acknowledged. When we get into their second album, it's really quick and aggressive, and it's clear that there's a lack of communication between band members. Lou actually went as far as to fire Andy Warhol, and it might have had something to do with people thinking that Andy was actually the lead guitarist for the band. Nico would also leave the band at this point, and there's this sense of growing disdain within the group. John described Lou as being controlling and demanding, and eventually Lou would kick John out of the band. I think Lou had a less avant-garde vision for what direction the band was going in, but at the same time for their third album, we saw how other band members like Mo were starting to branch out into singing. Mo's After Hours was really like a breath of fresh air. It's sweet and endearing and full of heart, and I can clearly see why it made a really popular closing song for their set lists. And then we finally get to Loaded, and at this point Mo was pregnant, so she didn't contribute as heavily to the release of this album. And we also see how it's more conventional and more pop rock compared to their first release. It was essentially the dissolving of the high culture aesthetic of the Banana Album. I actually thought it was pretty funny how the track Sweet Jane actually sounds a lot like a hippie song. And at this point, Sterling leaves the band and goes back to college, and this is kind of where the movie ends. The film really made me wonder how important avant-garde experimentation really was to Lou. Was it just a means to an end of becoming a popular rock star? Was releasing a more conventional pop rock album like Loaded Lou's end goal? Part of me says yes because Lou always dreamed of becoming a rock star, but another part of me isn't so sure, because I don't think he ever really sacrificed his true authenticity to get there. When you listen to tracks like Cool It Down off of Loaded, it's clear that he's not shying away from darker themes. Overall, I think if you like punk and want to explore some of its earliest origins, this film gives a really good overview of one of the most influential bands of all time. And if you're also like me and have only really listened to Loaded, trust me, you will be doing yourself a huge service by watching this film. If nothing else, please listen to Heroin and Velvet and Furs off of the first release, the Banana album, the Velvet Underground and Nico. The songs are incredibly vivid and experimental and gritty, and it really shows that great music doesn't have to follow conventions, and oftentimes it breaks conventions. Thanks for watching.